Thank you, Jay. So as Jay said, biomass is just at the beginning. This industry is only at the beginning, and hopefully we are able to gain enough insight so that we can help it move along sooner rather than later. I will open the floor to questions, and we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if there's anybody that would like to start. Yes, in the back.
For Mark, because you mentioned the RFS program, with these distributed systems, we've got the depot model. Are you guys thinking at all about how there could be tracking and verification of the feedstock issues associated with combining them all?
Can you repeat that? Stand up, maybe come a little bit closer.
Hi, this question's for Mark. Just because you mentioned the RFS program, with these distributed systems where you have the depot and you're commingling all of the feedstocks, are you guys thinking at all about how that could be challenging under the RFS program because you can't verify and track the source of the feedstocks?
So for everybody that is online with us, the question referred to the fact that if we're going to have a distributed depot system, how would we be able to track the source of the material for the RFS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I think that especially that pertains especially to the if there's like C&D waste, because that was a big issue that was with that waste type, that you're not quite sure if after a storm, you know, a lot of that wood waste got blown around, and so the actual location was problematic. But currently, I mean, you know, there are, I mean, John could probably talk to this, but certainly the knowing at least from his collection radius, you certainly know where that biomass is coming, and he's able to generate RINs from it, which is going towards the RFS2. And I would just assume that the depot would also employ that same type. They would actually know where the biomass that they are actually getting is coming from, and so hopefully that would be enough for it to satisfy the RFS2 requirement.
Do we have another question?
Yes, first I'd like to compliment Jay Gunderson and his family. It seems like a hard way to meet a fly, and a lot of hard work you're putting into that. Really, congratulations for that. But this comes to the other issue. I guess this is directed towards USDA and DOE. Quite truthfully, it seems like you're flogging a dead horse. Trying to make something work out of 2 tons per acre when the rest of us, when we were trying to submit stuff on our root crops, they were pushing us for much higher yields on energy crops. So my point is, why isn't the Department of Energy, USDA, broadening their research and commercialization development to a number of higher yield dedicated energy crops, especially the root varieties, rather than continuing to go after low yield crops such as the corn stoves?
So for everybody that is online, the question relates to the yield of the crops that have been targeted up to now, and the potential for targeting root crops that have higher yields.
Okay. No, from the DOE standpoint, I mean, I believe like corn stover is just, you know, perhaps the low-hanging fruit right now. You know, there certainly is a lot of corn that's already being harvested for the corn grain, and so being able to access the stover, which is already out there, is you know, there's certainly a lot of stover out there. It makes sense to try to convert that over to cellulosic biofuels. But if you take a look at even the newer billion ton 16, you'll see that the opportunity for energy crops, especially miscanthus and switchgrass and higher yielding crops, is certainly there's certainly a strong potential for that in the future years, and that's certainly what DOE is hoping to encourage, and encourage that transition over to energy crops. Anybody from USDA?
Bill, any comments?
Sure.
Bill, would you like to come here?
USDA is firmly committed to putting together a whole portfolio of crops and supporting crops that do have high yield potential. As Mark just said, we support miscanthus. We're supporting energy cane, which can get 22 dry tons per acre. That's a pretty high yielding crop. We're also committed to supporting emerging crops, and we do that to the best of our ability. Root crops have some challenges when you're considering where they might be planted with it, and the process by which they would be harvested requires basically disturbing the soil. And we're looking at erosion control as being something that's really key to supporting water quality. So I think there's some work that really needs to be done to show that root crops can be sustainably harvested and move forward. But we're firmly supportive of trying to help develop that technology and the genetics that overlay that. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Bill. Do we have any other questions? Yes? Could you come a little bit closer to the front?
Question for Jay. It's just, in the absence of a contract for residue, how are you handling that? Taking more off, leaving it in the field?
Just to repeat the question for the audience online, the question relates to how does our farmer, Jay, deal with the fact that he doesn't have a contract for the commodity delivered.
If you're speaking about the biomass, if I don't have a contract, I'm not going to roll it up. It's that simple, because if I don't have a marketplace for it, I'm not going to invest the money it takes to have it, as again, back to my comment of being a specialty crop, I need an end user to be willing to purchase that before I'm going to invest the money in rolling that up and having it in storage ready for delivery.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question for Harry. So you mentioned about the lab limited animal manure, the consumer supply chain. Could you explain a little bit and provide more insights? Are you considering utilizing the source of animal manure for the consumer supply chain or reduce cost or improve the quantity volume? Yes.
For the audience online, the question relates to the supply chain for corn stover and how it can be improved.
So I think what you're speaking about is I had things that might affect participation in farmers' willingness to, so stover is viewed as, and Jay may be able to give more specifics on this, stover is viewed as a soil amendment in some cases, going to, in some cases, if there's not too much of it, improve the soil quality. And it would serve then as a substitute. Animal manure could potentially serve as a substitute for that. So to the extent that there is available animal manure, for example, in areas where there's cattle production, then you would be able to use that, take the stover off, and use that animal manure as a substitute for those nutrients going back in the soil. And so then that potentially would matter to the pricing or the pricing of the stover and the value of the stover to the farmer.
Carrie, if I can follow up with a question. You referred to two different collection and delivery systems. Maybe you could comment a little bit about the two approaches.
The two collection systems?
Mm-hmm.
I can comment as much as an economist knows about that. I'm happy to do that. So the way I understand it, there's two different ways to collect the stover. One is the producer, it's going to be laying in the field. The producer will bale that. Jay described that. The producer bales it and then collects it, and in some cases moves it to the field side where the processor then would come pick it up and handle all the logistics. The other is full logistics handling by the producer. In Jay's case, they would do that. And the case that John described is where they are actually going into the field and baling it and collecting and delivering it to the plant. So I don't think that either plant is using one collection mechanism solely. Contracts will specify who enters the field, when they enter the field, how much is being taken off. And so you really have, it's not as simple as the way I presented it. You really have a host of options in terms of the collection and the logistic and the harvest and the transportation.
And maybe, John, you have some comments to that as well?
Well, I might address the earlier question too a little bit in that same context. Some of our most vigorous partners are hog feeders in central Iowa. So someone that already has a self-contained market for his grains. So hog feeders typically graze corn on corn because they raise enough hogs to feed all of that product too. And as Kerry said, then they end up with a manure product that contains the phosphorus and potassium, especially in the corn grain that passes through the animal, and now is in a much better form to be returned to the earth than having left the grain or stover on the field. So they want to raise corn on corn. They're raising high yields. They have abundant stover, and it's problematic for them just in keeping their yields at par with their neighbors who might be managing with crop rotation, and they have to use heavy tillage passes to be able to manage it. Also, the way that they put that manure back on their fields is they inject it. And when you come out in early fall, because your manure pits are full, and you're trying to inject that into a field that was just harvested, it's got moist, tough, heavy loads of residue on it. You start creating what I call bunny hutches across the field. It plugs up your equipment. It bunches up into piles that the farmer has to pause, back up, go around, and start injecting again. And then he has to come back and manage those piles later. So when we come in and partially harvest that manure for him, he now has a field that has uniform, less, but moderate stover loads on. He can knife his manure on. He can forego his fall heavy tillage pass and still have sufficient cover to protect him into spring for soil and for water and wind erosion of his soils, and make a quick tillage pass or not, maybe strip till for planting in the spring, and it works out really well. So I think that's another way that stover harvest can match in crop residues with animal production. Cattle feeders, not quite so much, because they're already doing some of that. They have opportunities to use stover as a supplemental part of their feed if they're not cutting it as silage, and also for bedding. And in that manner, the manure adds to the bedding, composts the stover, and they can return both products back to the soil in a much beneficial form to the soil and to not interfere with the subsequent crop. So they're some of our highest participants. Jay.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I guess if you think back to my introduction we do raise 16,000 head of hogs annually, so we do have, just as John brought to the table, we do have a need for a place for the animal waste or the manure to be applied. And it does replace a lot of the nutrients. It helps rebuild the organic matter levels that will be removed in the stover. So yes, they work very much hand in hand.
Do you have any other questions?
I've got one for Mr. Weaver and Mr. Anderson. For the Nevada plant and also for you as an end producer, how vital is BCAP to making the economics work? Would it work without the BCAP program, or are you past the point where, are you at the point now where you can do it without BCAP program?
I'm going to repeat the question for the audience online. The question refers to the importance of BCAP in making, connecting the farmer to the facility, and whether it would be possible at this point or at some point in the future to occur without the assistance of BCAP.
Okay, to speak to it from my perspective, BCAP has been important and will continue to be important, I think, as this industry gets off the ground and gets going in a consistent manner. Just as with the corn ethanol industry, it took some time for it to go out and essentially stand on its own. I think eventually the biomass market will also reach that point. At just my perspective this time, we're not there yet. So yes, I feel BCAP is an important part of this process.
We've not used the BCAP as we've started our startup supply chain, owning the equipment and purchasing the material under contract at the point of baling doesn't quite fit for the current BCAP. But as we understand our supply chain and get our processes down, we are bringing in good producers like Jay who understand both ends of the needs for that supply chain, and will start to deliver us material direct to the plant. And we're working to understand how BCAP can either work directly, or we can adjust the way we contract so that it can offset some of those investment costs that those producers will have to get involved in the harvest system for us.
Unless we have another pressing question, I'm going to ask everybody to thank our panel.